So welcome to Israel, Palestine 101 with renowned Professor Alan Dowty. This topic is always relevant, and especially now, as we seem to be at an inflection point in the relationship of the Jewish community in America to Israel. And of course, as always, knowledge and understanding are key. To set the stage, in the preface of one of his books, Professor Dowty says, and I quote, "Can an introduction to the highly charged Arab-Israel conflict be objective and yet communicate the depth of emotions and humanity on both sides? Perhaps the goal is hopelessly naive. Yet it is precisely in the discussion of hotly contested issues where it is hardest to achieve that the subject refuses to go away. Perhaps it is an unachievable goal, but that does not relieve us as scholars from the responsibility of trying to approach it as much as we possibly can," close quotes. And with that, I want to let you know our program is a collaborative one, a partnership of Hadassah and the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut. And so I'd like to welcome Karen Blaustein, President of Eastern Connecticut Hadassah, for a couple of welcoming remarks. Karen?
I am very delighted to welcome you all. I know there's at least 2 participants from Florida, maybe more. And so it's great that we can gather together via Zoom and approach this very important topic with a renowned expert. Thank you, Sheila, for organizing it with Rachel and Marcia and getting all the logistics together. So let's move right on.
Thank you so much, Karen. And now Rachel, the Executive Director of the Federation, your welcoming remarks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this very snowy night. I'm so glad you were all able to make it. And I think we might even have additional people who wouldn't have been able to make it if it had not been snowing. So I started as the Executive Director June 1st. I'm only saying that because I see so many new faces and I would love to meet everyone here another time. It's really wonderful to see so many people for this very important topic. For those of you who don't know, I was in Israel for Hanukkah visiting family, and Israel is very important to me and my family. We have a mission from Federation going to Israel in March. There are still a couple of spaces available if you'd love to join the 24 people who are going with Jerry Fisher and Ella Sackett. We would love to hear from you in the next few days, and we'll book your tickets immediately. And we want to make sure everybody on this call is receiving our newspaper, The Jewish Leader. If you haven't been getting it monthly, call our office and let us know. We'd be happy to send you a free newspaper every month. And lastly, we have relocated. We have a new office now in Norwich at Beth Jacob Synagogue. And we're very happy there. The 8 staff members are there together. And what I wanted to say is we have a special desk that Ken Fishberg has named the Hadassah desk. So we would love to host anyone from Hadassah at any time. We have a little spot picked out for you. So feel free to make yourselves at home. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And now let me call on Romana Primus, who has a special connection to Professor, to introduce him to us. Romana?
I thank you. So Professor Alan Dowty is an author, historian, and Professor Emeritus of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Before coming to Notre Dame, Professor Dowty was chair of the Department of International Relations at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And after retiring from Notre Dame, he served as the Kanoff Chair Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Calgary and President of the Association for Israel Studies. In 2017, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award in Israel Studies by the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. He has published 7 books and over 130 articles on the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, and international relations. Among the books are The Limits of American Isolationism, the Middle East Crisis, U.S. Decision-Making in 1958, 1970, and 1973, and The Jewish State, a Century Later, and Israel-Palestine, which is now in its 3rd edition. He has delivered over 500 public lectures in 20 countries. Most recently, he served for the 2nd time as a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Oxford University. Chuck and I are lucky people for many reasons, but one of those reasons is that when we have a question about Israel or about the Middle East in general, we have Alan Dowty's private telephone number. So Alan, welcome to Southeast Connecticut. We all look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Romana. And it's a particular pleasure to be able to speak to the community of which I'm sure you are a vital part, Romana and Chuck. We go back to 1975, so Romana probably knows a little bit too much about me, but she fortunately left all that out. Anyway, it is a particular pleasure to be here. And I thank Sheila for reading the foreword to the book, because it does emphasize here that when the subject is particularly controversial, it's particularly important to try to get the facts straight. It's always more important, because it's controversial, to try to reach a detached analysis. And my approach here is to try to present the narratives of both sides as fairly as I can. Of course, speaking to a Jewish audience, I'm sure you'll be able to read between the lines here somewhat. I found it useful to begin with some basic geography. You have here a map of the area. And the basic lesson here is the difference in scale. Well, Connecticut's a small state, so maybe this won't be as impressive as it would be elsewhere. But what you have here is 3 north-south zones, beginning with the coastal plain. If you can follow this on the map, Tel Aviv would be located about here. Then a central hilly ridge in which Jerusalem would be located about here. And finally, the Jordan Valley with the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea, the lowest point on earth. Now, the difference in scale, think of this, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan Valley, it's an average about 60 or 70 miles. And from north to south, from all the way up here north of the Sea of Galilee down, and you can't see it on this map, to Aqaba, to Eilat on the south, is about 250 miles. So the total area is about the same as the state of New Jersey, if that gives you any indication. So we're going to talk, first of all, about the historical origins of this conflict, then about the way the conflict has evolved into the current situation, and finally, the current outlook, which you're going to ask me about if I don't cover it already. But this is the framework for what we'll be talking about. But let's begin by getting rid of some persistent myths that you hear about this conflict. This is not an age-old conflict. It began with European Jewish settlers arriving in Palestine about 140 years ago, in the 1880s. And before that, Jews generally dwelt peacefully, if not as equals. They were second class, but they dwelt peacefully in Arab lands, including Palestine. Palestine always had a Jewish community. It lived as a recognized minority under Muslim rule at the time we're talking about, in the 1880s, of course, under the Ottoman Turks. Secondly, this is not a conflict that's caused by ethnic hatreds. The mutual hostility has certainly grown immensely over the course of the conflict, but I would argue more as a result than a cause. And again, Jewish minorities in the past generally fared better in the Arab or Muslim world than they did in Europe, and I don't think I have to elaborate on that. This is also not a conflict that's rooted in religious differences. Certainly, religious issues have emerged, but Judaism and Islam recognize each other as legitimate monotheistic faiths. So what is it about? At its core, it was and is a fight between two peoples over one land. And as he often did, Israel's founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, put it very succinctly, we and they want the same thing. We both want Palestine. You can divide the conflict into 4 stages, with the 4th stage emerging since the turn of the century. The first stage, from the 1880s to 1948, this was a collision between two communities in Palestine over land and control. And the photo here, if you can see it, is the visit of Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, on his one and only trip to the area in 1898. He's outside the village of El Arish in Sinai. They're looking for places for Jewish settlement. The second stage, from 1948 until the late 1980s, it's an interstate conflict between the new state of Israel and its neighboring Arab states, the Palestinians being temporarily eclipsed as a major independent actor. And here in the photo is the declaration of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948, by David Ben-Gurion. The third stage, which has roots in the 1960s, but fully emerges after the first Intifada in the late 1980s, witnesses the reemergence of Palestine or Palestinians as the major actor opposite Israel. We use the term Arab-Israel conflict, which really describes the interstate period best. It's really now become an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the 1990s, it did seem for a while to be on the verge of resolution. I had a colleague in Jerusalem who wrote a book about the end of the conflict. Unfortunately, it was a little bit premature. The fourth stage, since the turn of the century roughly, we have the second Intifada beginning in the year 2000 and the collapse of the peace process. And why do I call this a different stage? Because it's marked by some totally new or much more important forces, radical religious forces. It would become much more prominent in the conflict. New actors, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. What you see in the photo here, the photo on the previous section, of course, is Yasser Arafat, who sort of symbolizes the emergence of the Palestinians. The photo here is a training camp for young children, military training camp for young children held by the Hamas movement in Gaza. Now, we have to take a look here at some of these maps. If you see, and it's a little covered up on my, but the map of, maybe I can move this. Can you see my cursor? All right. The southern area here under the Ottomans, the area around Jerusalem, was governed directly by Constantinople, reported because of its religious significance of Jerusalem in particular. It was an independent district reporting directly to Constantinople. The two districts that now comprise the northern part of Israel were part of a province governed from Beirut. There was no unit labeled Palestine. The Ottomans and the Muslims generally avoided that designation because that has more importance in Western history than in theirs. What you have after World War I is the map that the British established. Forget for the moment about the two different colors here. It's the borders that go down the Jordan Valley and the Jordan Rift, the border of Egypt on one side and Syria and Lebanon on the other, drawn in cooperation between Britain and France, which governed the countries to the north. And the importance of this is that this becomes essentially the standard reference when you talk about Palestine. When you want to know historically what is Palestine, there are a number of possible answers. But since World War I, the British mandate borders have generally been the point of reference. Now, initially, in the 1880s, neither side recognized the presence of another people with collective rights as a people in this area. The Arabs and the Turks regarded Jews only as a religion, and they saw the Jewish settlers as European colonialist invaders. The settlers saw the Arabs as individuals who would benefit, not as a people with their own collective identity. It was only toward the end of the mandate in 1937 that the Jewish leadership, over much opposition and with many reservations, accepted the British proposal to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And the borders proposed, and here we go back to this map, and this time with attention to the different colors. The purple here represents what would have been the Jewish state under the British proposal, about 20% of the entire territory of Palestine. And most of the rest of it, in here in green, would have been the Arab state. Jerusalem would have been internationalized with a corridor to the sea. The Arabs rejected the British proposal, 1937. Their argument was that the area was an integral part of the Arab world. It still had an overwhelming Jewish majority, about 2/3 at that time, and that the Arabs as a majority were entitled to self-determination. And also, of course, the previous argument that the Jews are not a nation, the Jews are not a people. The Jews are just a religion, assuming their right to tell us who we are. 10 years later, they gave the same response to the UN partition plan of 1947. Now, even the names of the wars are politicized in this conflict. For Israel, this is the War of Independence. For the Palestinians, this is An-Nakba, which means the disaster, which tells you something about the outcome of the war. The British had turned the problem over to the new United Nations, and a United Nations Special Commission on Palestine again proposed partition, this time with a map that would have created a Jewish state in 56% of Palestine. What you see here in orange. This follows more or less the lines of population at the time, with the Negev, the southern part, largely empty for room for growth and to absorb refugees from the Holocaust. Each state is composed of 3 parts joined together at 2 points. Those points also serve as the connection between the other state. The Arab state will be in 3 parts here in yellow. This is kind of a checkerboard. In geometry, they say a point has no dimensions. So that's what you're trying to do here with each state really in 3 different parts. Obviously, a scheme like this could work only with total cooperation, which did not exist. And already immediately after this was adopted by the General Assembly in the United Nations, the fighting began in November of 47. On May 15th, 48, the British left And by then, Jewish forces, fighting forces, controlled most of the Jewish areas, most of the areas in orange, and they declared the existence of the state of Israel, which was immediately invaded by the Arab armies of 5 states. But the Jewish forces held on and eventually occupied 78% of Palestine, and I'll get to that in a minute. People ask about the outcome of this war with some wonderment. How could the Jewish population, which was outnumbered 50-1 by the combined population of the Arab world, how could the Jewish fighting forces have been so successful? Well, as it turns out, they actually had more forces in the field, given the total mobilization of the Jewish community in Palestine and the relatively small size of Arab armed forces. They were also unified with strong leadership at the top, whereas the Arab countries entering the war often were entering this to check each other, totally uncoordinated between themselves. And their rivalries were a major obstacle in their war effort. The Israeli forces also enjoyed the benefit of internal lines and being able to shift forces quickly from one front to another and sort of to take one enemy at a time. The Arab forces were overconfident, badly led. The governments behind them were corrupt. And let's not forget one important factor here. This is 3 years after the end of the Holocaust. And many of the fighters on the Israeli side were, in fact, survivors and refugees from the Holocaust. One of the books written here was titled Forged in Fury. And that pretty much describes the mindset of the Israeli fighting forces. The consequence of the war is that Israel gained much more of Palestine than it would have acquired by the partition plan. As I said, 78%. And as you see here from the map, all that's in yellow, the exceptions were the West Bank. The term begins to be used at this point. That's the area in which the army of Transjordan held on. And then it annexed this area and renamed itself Jordan. The other area held by Arab forces at the war's end was the Gaza Strip, occupied but not annexed by Egypt. The conflict is now an interstate conflict. The Arab states refuse to negotiate. They institute a total boycott of Israel. They have no incentive to accept the result of a war that ended badly for them and that they hope to counter in the future. It's a tragedy for the Palestinians. Their community is devastated. Many are refugees. Their leadership is scattered. And while the Arab states give them support, the Arab states also have their own interests that do not include Palestinian independence. So no Palestinian state is created. All of the Arab states have been opposed to it, so had the Arab Palestinians for that matter. So no preparations are made. The West Bank is annexed by Jordan. This is not recognized by the other Arab states. And we have the creation of the refugee issue. 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinians who fled in areas occupied by Israel, and they ended up in the West Bank and Gaza, also in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And their descendants are still there. At the time, again, about 750,000. Today, registered refugees number 5.7 million. All descendants of that original number. Only about a third of them, however, are still in the camps, the refugee camps. We now come to the second stage of the conflict, which is tied to changes on the global scene. I imagine you probably recognize this is a mature audience, which probably remembers back to the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser. This is Nasser. And with the decolonization that took place in the 1950s, you have the emergence of the third world between East and West. Nasser was a key figure in that, and the Arab world is swept by radical Arab nationalism, with the Soviet Union encouraging and exploiting that, of course. There are military coups in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, and Libya, and then the long guerrilla war in Algeria for independence from France. And this is led by Nasser in the Arab world, at least. And the Arab states aim to reverse the results of the 1948-49 war. There's open talk of a second round. And here you have a typical quote from Nasser himself. There will be no peace on Israel's border because we demand vengeance, and vengeance, typical of the rhetoric of the day. Then we come to the 1956 war. The background was a question of Israeli passage through the Strait of Tiran, which is located here at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Israel's southern port is Eilat up here. I'm assuming you can see the cursor. And the passage goes through a narrow passage. It's more narrow than it looks on this map, easily controlled from the shore, from the Sinai Peninsula. And in 1955, Nasser had cut off Israeli passage through this strait, in violation, by the way, of international law, which decrees that this is an international passage. Israel was sworn to change this, and the chance came about when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and that's over here, in 1956. The British and the French wanted to reoccupy the canal, so they concocted together with Israel a plan for Israel to initiate a war in which Britain and France would then intervene and, by the way, reoccupy the canal. This was supposedly a secret plan, which, of course, didn't remain very secret for very long. The British and the French, under great international pressure, including from the United States, was forced to retreat when they barely, in fact, started their invasion. Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula up to the canal, but was also forced to withdraw in the following months. However, they did gain passage through the Strait of Tiran because an international force, the very first UN peacekeeping force, UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force, was formed in 1957 in order to guarantee international passage through this strait. All right, forward 10 years. Again, the name of the war reflects the opposed perspective. For Israel, it's a 6-day war. For Arabs, it's simply the June War. And it begins when the Soviet Union, which was very close to the regime in Syria at the time, and was afraid that that Israel was going to attack Syria, move into Damascus, and actually replace the regime there. The Soviet Union therefore urged Egypt to mobilize in order to deter Israel. And Nasser reacted in a much more dynamic way than the Soviet Union had anticipated. And among other things, he expels the UNEF forces from Sinai and blockades the Strait of Tiran again, recreating the issue over which Israel had already fought one war. Enthusiasm sweeps through the Arab world. The time of the second round has come. Syria and Jordan both put their forces under Egyptian command. This time the Arab world is going to be unified. Nasser openly declares that there is going to be a war and that it will be a war to destroy Israel. The best evidence we have is that Nasser did feel that Egypt was ready to withstand the Israeli army, at least long enough for international pressure to do what it had done in 1956. They'd had 10 years of buildup with Soviet support, arms shipments, and large quantities to Egypt and to Syria. The Arab world was this time much more unified. Israel this time was much more isolated. No British or French support. This is a typical Arab cartoon of the time. Nasser is kicking a rather anti-Semitic depiction of Jews off of the cliff in Aqaba. The other Arab countries are standing here behind. This gives you some idea of the spirit of the occasion. In the first hours of 1967 war, the Israeli army, the Air Force, destroyed the three opposing air forces. It's very simple. Surprise attack in the morning of June 5th. The Arab air forces are essentially crippled, and in desert warfare, without air cover, the result is pretty well predetermined. In 6 days, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the remaining parts of Palestine, the Golan Heights on the Syrian border, and the entire Sinai Peninsula, you see here on the map. Now, what's different here is that Israel now occupies the areas of Arab states. This is not just about Palestine anymore. And although we didn't see it at the time, and most of us were of sufficient age to be following these events at the time, but this was the beginning of disengagement for the Arab states. Egypt already disengaged in 1979. Jordan disengaged in 1994. These are events that are set in motion by the fact that they concluded that they could not defeat Israel in a state-to-state war. The war also does create a theoretical basis for negotiation. Israel now has some cards to play with in negotiation. Before, Israel had little to offer the Arab states. Now it has land that it can trade for peace. And they made this offer immediately to Egypt and to Syria, not to Jordan, because the West Bank is a much more complicated issue, but to Egypt and Syria. A little bit too soon. The Egyptians weren't ready until 10 or 12 years later, and the Syrians still are not ready. But also in the aftermath of the war, UN Resolution 242 is adopted, which is based on the idea of land for peace, that Israel would make peace with its neighbors, return occupied territories, debate over whether some or all of those territories, and the Arab states would establish peace treaties with Israel. Now, Israel has occupied this land, most of it ever since, under the international law of military occupation, which was never designed for long, protracted periods. It's now been over 50 years. Israeli settlements did begin soon after the war. Israeli settlements in particularly the West Bank, conquered territory. And initially, where Jewish settlements had existed before 1948, or places that were of particular strategic importance, like the Golan Heights or the Jordan Valley. In 1970, Egypt gets a new president, Sadat, who believes that he could unlock the diplomacy by a limited military maneuver. Most of us didn't think that the Arab world had any real major military options left. But Egypt and Syria attacked on Yom Kippur, 1973, and managed in the Egyptian case to cross the canal and hold on to some territory to the east. And it worked for Sadat in the sense that it unlocked the diplomacy. Kissinger, remember Henry Kissinger? Yeah, okay. Jumps into action and brokers a disengagement agreement, first between Egypt and Israel, and then between Syria and Israel. And when further progress stalls, Sadat pulled his second surprise by getting himself invited to visit Jerusalem in November of 77 and addressing the Knesset, setting in motion the process that led to the first peace treaty in the conflict on the basis of land for peace. Now, Egypt was ostracized for a few years by the Arab states, but eventually was restored to its natural position. The Arab League returned to its headquarters in Cairo, and so on and so on. It's been a cold peace on the Egyptian side. Very few Egyptians avail themselves of the chance to visit Israel. But let's not overlook the fact that it's held for 43 years. In the Middle East, that's no small accomplishment. Furthermore, there has been no full-scale war since then. I'll talk about the 82 invasion of Lebanon in a minute, but a full-scale state-to-state war among the major parties, 73 was the last one. And without Egypt, the remaining Arab states really don't have that kind of a military option. We now go to the third stage of the conflict. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is founded in 1964. That's before the Six-Day War. And after 67, it goes through a great growth because it's become clear to the Palestinians that the Arab states are not going to be able to destroy Israel for them. And the Arab states have begun this process of disengagement I talked about. Photo here, incidentally, is a young Yasser Arafat together with Nasser. The PLO was eventually expelled from Jordan and took over southern Lebanon since the Lebanese government was too weak to prevent that from happening, which was their last front against Israel. They'd never been allowed to operate from Syrian territory. And in response to Palestinian raids across the border with Lebanon, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, and under Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, moved all the way to Beirut, expelling the PLO from southern Lebanon. And Sharon actually had a bigger design here, which was to reshape Lebanese politics completely and set up a Lebanese government under the Christian Lebanese that would be allies of Israel. That didn't take place, particularly after there was a massacre of Palestinian refugees at Sabra and Shatila by Christian Lebanese forces, and Israel eventually withdrew in stages from Lebanon in 1983 and 1985. The border was temporarily quiet, but the growth of Hezbollah comes into the picture here. Hezbollah was formed in reaction to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It's a Lebanese organization, and I'll come back to it in a minute. The full emergence of the Palestinians was marked by the outbreak of the First Intifada in late 1987. This was an intifada. Intifada, an Arabic word meaning shaking off, which is used in political context to mean essentially insurrection or rebellion. And it's marked in this case by protests and demonstrations and low-level violence in the West Bank and Gaza against the Israeli army and targets. Israel was now looking for options, for new options. There's a new Israeli government under Yitzhak Rabin in 1992. The idea of disengagement not just with the Arab states, but also from the West Bank and Gaza, begins to be popular. And the PLO also is facing a dilemma. It's facing the end of its military options. Remember, the collapse of the Soviet Union comes into the picture, so they lose an important supplier. So in 1992, 1993, secret talks between representatives who were eventually accredited by the Israeli government and Palestinians important in the PLO begin to take place first of all, in Norway. And so then finally in September 1993, we get the famous handshake on the White House lawn. You'll find the body language here kind of interesting. Here's Clinton, of course, pulling the two together. Arafat beaming, he was a great role player, and Rabin looking like he swallowed a frog. But in any event, this did mark a turning point in certain respects. It was the first mutual recognition between the credible mainstream leadership of the two sides. And over the next 8 years, we had what we call the peace process, where one of my colleagues wrote the book about this being the end of the conflict. There were further agreements. The Palestinian Authority, the first more or less Palestinian government, is created. It's given control of 40% of the West Bank, but 96% of the Arab population on the West Bank. All of this culminating in talks at Camp David and Taba in 2000, 2001, which by most accounts is the closest we've ever come to a resolution of the entire conflict. The two sides were 3% apart on the territorial division of the West Bank. There would have been some annexation of areas where settlers lived in the West Bank, and the Palestinians would have been compensated by empty land somewhere else. And they were only apart by about 3% of the total area on the West Bank. But then the roof fell in. During this century and a quarter, nationalism and not religion was the dominant force. And furthermore, in the last phase, we've seen a trend to reducing the conflict to its core parties. The peripheral Arab states are dropping out. Israel and the Palestinians are left face to face. But what happened was the thunderous collapse of the entire Oslo process and what I label as the fourth stage of the conflict. And behind this are some fundamental changes in world politics, which obviously have an influence in the Middle East as elsewhere. First, that states are increasingly challenged by what we clinically call non-state actors. Principal examples in this case are Hamas and Hezbollah in the Palestinian world, opposed to the Palestinian Authority. Secondly, the nature of wars has changed. We've seen an end to conventional wars and the development of what we call, well, the theorists call them asymmetric wars between a stronger party and a weaker party, irregular wars, counterinsurgency, subconventional wars, or just plain fuzzy wars, in which there are no fronts, no victors, everything is a little bit fuzzy. And then the third factor very clearly is the rise of religious radicalism that justifies the pursuit of total aims by violent means, and the suicide bomber became, there have always been suicide bombers in this conflict. This is a creation of the fourth stage of the conflict. Suicide bombers represent that kind of religious extremism here. And Israel is not immune from this. Israel has had its own religious radicalism, not suicide bombers, thankfully, but the assertion of certain elements of the settler population, that they are there by the grace of God, and that it would be a violation of their religious beliefs to leave. And furthermore, that this justifies persecution of the Arabs in that area. All of this comes together in the aftermath of Israel's war in Lebanon in 82, when Hezbollah appears on the picture. This is an Arab but non-Palestinian movement based on the Shia Muslim population of southern Lebanon. And it's inspired and guided by the Shia regime in Iran. This is a photo of the founder and current leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Iran's role adds a new dimension to the conflict. Iran had been very peripheral in the conflict. The first edition of my text on this conflict, I checked during this period, and I don't even have Iran in the index. I assure you that in the second edition and following, Iran is there because they've become an important actor. And they now are the sponsor of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They are influential in blocking any kind of a negotiated solution. And this represents a significant strategic shift, given Iran's resources as a state and, above all, its aspirations for nuclear weapons. The Hezbollah program indicates what's changed here. And you read it here, it says, "We see in Israel the vanguard of the United States in our Islamic world. Our struggle will end only when this entity, meaning Israel, is obliterated." This is not just a fight with Israel. This is a worldwide conflict with the United States as the main enemy. This is a whole new mindset that we're dealing with here. Hezbollah was an important model in the rise of Hamas, which is a Palestinian movement, of course, sparked by the Intifada, the first Intifada, just as Hezbollah had been a response to the war in Lebanon. And in the Hezbollah and Hamas worldview, eventual victory is assured. Time is on their side as they see it. All of the recent history is interpreted as a series of victories. The expulsion of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, the exit of the United States from Lebanon in the mid-80s, and later Somalia, remember Black Hawk Down? And then the Israeli withdrawals from Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005, which Israelis think of as gestures of moderation and are seen by forces like Hezbollah and Hamas as evidence of their eventual victory. Jews are charged with responsibility for the two world wars, for both communism and capitalism, and for conspiracy to rule the world. The Hamas charter, the original charter at least, has a specific reference to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, an infamous anti-Semitic forgery. And the leader of Hamas at one point was quoted as saying, "The conflict of Israel is not a matter of land. It's a matter of ideology." So you see how things have shifted here. And there's a fundamental belief that there can be no peace with Israel. And the original Hamas charter, which you can read here, talks about the land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf, that means trust, consecrated for Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. This is a photo of the founder of Hamas, Ahmed Yassin, who was killed by Israel in 2004. It was clear by 2006 that the conflict has entered a new stage. And in January of that year, Hamas wins a majority in the Palestinian legislature that had been set up under the Palestinian Authority. Now, Mahmoud Abbas is still president. He was elected in 2005 to a 4-year term, which is now going into what, its 18th year, 17th or 18th year, but since Arafat died in 2004. But since June of 2007, Hamas has controlled Gaza. Hamas seized Gaza unilaterally, and control of the Palestinian territories has been divided ever since then, the 15 years since then. Also in 2006, one of the new kinds of wars is triggered. Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers. Israel launches an attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon, primarily from the air, which is inadequate to inflict defeat or to stop the rockets that Hezbollah launches on Israeli targets. And they now have rockets that can reach anywhere in Israel. The war was seen by most parties as a Hezbollah victory, even though they suffered heavier losses. And Israeli withdrawal, as I've said, from Lebanon and from Gaza was seen as victory for armed struggle, not as a conciliatory move. As a result, the support in Israel for unilateral disengagement disappears. Lebanon becomes a base for Hezbollah, Gaza becomes a base for Hamas attacks, and there have been renewed clashes in some of these fuzzy wars between Israel and Hamas, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2021. And as a result of that, Israeli and other factors, Israeli politics has turned very sharply to the right. It's not all bad news. There are other forces at work. First of all, Oslo does have some positive legacies. The gap between the two sides is far narrower than it was before Oslo. We had the first mutual recognition of mainstream leadership of the two sides, the first Palestinian self-governance on its own soil, the second peace treaty of the conflict, that Jordan responding to Oslo, and ongoing interaction and contact on all different levels that didn't exist before Oslo came along. Also, in recent years, we've seen that the threat of radical Islam has driven some Arab regimes in those states that have sort of dropped out of the conflict. This is now being propelled in part by the threat of radical Islam in these areas, the threat of Iran, of ISIS. Egypt and Jordan both have fairly stable relations now with Israel. And a lot of informal ties existed in the Persian Gulf area well before the Abraham Accords. I was in Dubai a few years ago and encountered an Israeli kiosk there in the middle of the mall, selling the ahava products from the Dead Sea. I tried to talk to the guy in Hebrew, but he told me to shut up. It wasn't quite that friendly there yet. But in any event, the Abraham Accords that took place with the opening up of relations with 3 or 4 Arab countries should have been no surprise, because the path to this has been clear for some time. Third, there still is a stable base of support on both sides for a 2-state solution, although it's no longer a majority. The latest figures I have from about a year ago, it's about a third on both sides. And it would be a larger support for a 2-state solution if people felt it was actually possible. A great part of the drop in support for a 2-state solution has been on the grounds that it doesn't seem to be in the offing anytime soon. There have been 2 other major efforts to reach an overall peace agreement. The first, if you remember, Condoleezza Rice, during the period in which Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister of Israel, and then John Kerry during the second Obama administration. Here he is meeting with Abbas and with Netanyahu. In all cases, the framework of negotiation was a two-state solution. In fact, and I had the chance to ask Dennis Ross this myself, all diplomacy on Arab-Israel issues since Oslo has been based on the two-state model. In all three cases of negotiation here, this includes earlier on the Taba negotiations in 2001, in all three cases, there were severe time limits put on the negotiations. In the first two cases, because of Israeli politics, an impending election in 2001, Olmert's resignation from office in 2007 because of the corruption charges, and in 2013-14, the Palestinians imposed a 9-month limit on negotiations. So all three cases operated under extreme time pressure. And in all three cases, you have to say the Palestinians backed off. It was clear that the refugee community, which is the Palestinian refugees in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and on the West Bank and Gaza, are not a part of this process. They are the base. They were the base of support historically for the PLO, but they have not been brought along in this effort, which was led by the Arab states. And so Arafat in the first case and Abbas in the second two cases backed off when the opposition of the refugees became apparent. There's also the additional complication of Hamas control of Gaza. It's doubtful that any Israeli government, no matter how dovish, could sign an agreement that did not include something about the end of the threat from Gaza. Otherwise, what is it worth? So we now come, I see it's already 5 o'clock, and I will try to summarize this as, I think we got started 10 minutes late, but I'll try to wind this up as quickly as I can. But this obviously is the bottom line to the whole thing. Is the two-state solution dead? There's opposition to compromise on both sides, and as you saw now, majority opinion in Israel is opposed to a Palestinian state. But again, that is in part a reaction to the feeling that it isn't possible. There also is frustration over continuing violence on the Palestinian side. That's a strong argument, of course, in Israel. And continuing occupation and growth of Jewish settlements on the other side. Obviously, for Palestinians, this is an indication to them that Israel isn't serious about negotiating a solution to the conflict. And they argue that, in fact, the growth of Jewish settlements has become irreversible. You see here the statistics over time, the growth of the Jewish settlers in the West, no longer in Gaza, but in the West Bank. And it's now approaching 500,000, full 17% of the population of the West Bank. And here's an attempt to try to draw a map that would include as many settlers as possible. Well, this isn't the map, but this tells you what the problem is. The brown and yellow areas are areas that the Palestinian Authority either controls or has civil control of, at least. That's about 40% of the West Bank. The blue areas, it may not look like it at first, but the blue areas, the other 60%, which includes corridors through the other areas, that's still under the control of the Israeli army. So you can see here how complicated it would be to try to draw a map that would include most or the vast majority of Israeli settlers on the Israeli side of the line. What are other options? Well, I hear a lot about a binational state, but there are certain problems with the idea of the idea is a state in which the two sides share power, which sounds good and it has a lot of support in theory, but the track record for binational states is not tremendously good. We always hear Canada and Belgium, but I assure you, having given this talk in Canada, they don't agree that it's such a success there. I understand the same is true in Belgium. There are plenty of examples where efforts at binational states have fallen flat, and there's no point in getting into them. Sometimes I just simply ask the one question, okay, it's going to be a single state with somehow you're going to share power between Jews and Arabs. What will be the policy toward immigration? Whose right of return is going to be recognized? Obviously, for Israel, the right of all Jews to come to Israel is basic to the very rationale for the existence of Israel. Obviously, for the Palestinians, the right of the refugees to return to where their families lived before 48 is sacred also. So I can name any number of problems like that that are impossible really to work out. So my bottom line here is better a difficult divorce than a turbulent cohabitation. And the truth is that few, if any, Israeli Jews want to live in an Arab majority state. I mean, the whole idea of Zionism was a Jewish and democratic state. Israel is currently 20% Arab. What would it be with the West Bank and Gaza? The best projections here, and I'm cutting through just to the bottom line, that with Gaza included, it's already close to a majority Arab. It's about, the Jews are still just barely 50% of that population, and the trend is in the other direction toward the growth of the Arab population. In the long run, it will be a state with an Arab majority, with all that that implies. There's a legitimate question of whether a two-state solution is still possible. Maybe we've reached a point of no return because of Jewish settlements and so on. But there have been painful divisions along those lines in Czechoslovakia and Ethiopia and Sudan, Pakistan, Yugoslavia. I'd say the history of division into two states is more promising than the history of maintenance of a single state for two nationalities. And is it impossible to draw a line? Well, here is a map that's been devised at a think tank in Washington that claims that with a 5% annexation of the West Bank by Israel, you can see here, like balloons on a string, some of these settlements being included on the Israeli side of the line, that they can locate 80% of the settlers within Israeli territory without having to move anybody, meaning that only the other 20% living elsewhere in the West Bank would have to be relocated. Well, this map is 10 years old, so it's probably even more complicated than it was then. Indicates how complicated that whole thing would be. So what happens in the long term? It's important to see this in perspective. An agreed framework to solve this issue has only existed for the last 30 years of a conflict that's lasted for 140 years. And serious negotiation over basic issues has taken place for only a few months. In 2000, 2001, 2007 and 8, 2013, 14. Nevertheless, looking at the general trends, I think you can identify the emerging contours of what a settlement would look like. It'll be two states. The borders would be basically the lines, the armistice lines from before 67, with land swaps to bring Israeli settlements inside of Israel. Jerusalem, the Jewish side will be part of Israel, the Arab side will be the capital of Palestine, and the Palestinian state will be demilitarized. The refugees from 1948-49 would be returned to Palestine or resettled elsewhere. And the most difficult issues in the end would be the Temple Mount. Very hard for Israel to concede that the holiest place in Judaism, which is also the third holiest place in Islam, is going to remain under Muslim control. But that's simply what's in the cards. On the other hand, the Palestinians have something very difficult to swallow too, and that is that the refugees of 1948 and 49 and any conceivable final settlement are not going back to what is now the state of Israel. 5.7 million. No Israeli government is going to permit a significant number to come back. So what are the grounds for optimism? Well, initially, neither side even saw there was another side. Go back to the 1880s. Neither side even saw there was another side. It was half a century before compromise was even discussed. It was another half century before the leadership of the two sides recognized each other and accepted a framework for settlement. So maybe another half century to work out the details is not out of line. The critics have shown us that it will be very hard, but they have not shown that there's anything easier or better. And that concludes what I have to say. So, do you have any questions?
So thank you so much, Professor Dowty. And just to clarify for our viewers, you're in Seattle. That's why your time is 5 o'clock and our time is 8 o'clock, right? We just wanted to
I've
clear
got the
that
whole
up.
evening ahead of me if you've got
Right.
patience. Yeah.
Right. Just a couple of questions. I have one. One of our audience asks you, can Dr. Dowty clarify why the Arabs refused to form an Arab state?
In
We know the
48
Jews,
or
yeah, I think she means in 48. The Jews accepted the partition plan and formed their state. Why didn't the Arabs do something like that? I think that's the question.
well, if the Arabs had accepted the UN partition plan in 1948, it would have meant acceptance of a Jewish state in 56% of Palestine. And at that point, Jews constituted only about 40% or less of the population. So from the Arab point of view, as they saw it, there was no reason to accept a Jewish state at all. And so they were opposed to any arrangement that the cost of having an Arab state was to have a Jewish state alongside it. So they rejected the entire partition plan.
Right. Another question that I have is the formation of the refugee camps. What is the history, the correct history there? You read that the Arabs, the Palestinians were forced to flee. They were told to flee by the other Arab states. You read that the Jews evicted them. What is the true nature of how these refugee camps got started?
Okay, so you had 700 to 750,000 registered refugees. And I'm going to recommend a book by a colleague, Benny Morris, Palestine Refugee Question Revisited, in which he goes on a village by village basis. The bottom line is that in some cases, the Arabs fled before the Israeli army even got there. In some cases, they fled after the Israeli army got there. And in some cases, they were expelled. In case areas of military importance as the Israeli military saw it. So it's a mixed picture, and it varies according to the locale, and it varies according to the stage of the war. In the early stage of the war, Israel was trying to get the Arabs to stay in place in order to make the UN partition plan work. And later stage of the war, they saw that the lines at the end of the war were going to become the new reality. Then they started expelling. And there's some famous cases like Lydda and so on, where the Arab population was expelled. But that one book, the book by Benny Morris, will give you as complete a picture as we're likely to get. It's based primarily on Israeli sources because it was the Israeli military that was in charge of most of these areas.
Right. Professor, another question. How do you factor in the current Israeli government as we see it now forming as it relates to any prospects for future peace?
I was afraid somebody was, well, of course, I knew somebody was bound to ask that. And it's the, of course, an unavoidable question. There isn't any prospect of serious negotiations in the near future. This government does not include within it even any party that's likely to push for that. I mean, the religious Zionists, and for that matter, the two Haredi parties, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, are none of them interested in this. And of course, the religious Zionists include most of the leaders of the West Bank settlement community who are opposed to any kind of peace process. So it's dismal. I mean, you can argue about the current government on a number of grounds, number of issues, but as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, there isn't any real prospect for movement at all. Now, having said that, let me point out that since 2013-14, there hasn't been any prospect anyway. This isn't entirely a function of who happens to be the Israeli government at the moment. Since John Kerry gave up on his ill-fated mission, there's been no game in town anyway.
Right. And finally, Professor, you touched on this, the Temple Mount, the wall. What are Jerusalem, what are the various ideas for how Jerusalem could be configured if there was to be a settlement? What are the different theories about how to do that?
Well, most parties have subscribed to what's called the Clinton parameters. You know, in his final days in office, Bill Clinton, and this was the time of the talks at Taba, which were based on the Clinton parameters. And the parameter there was that Jewish Jerusalem would be a part of Israel and Arab Jerusalem would be a part of Palestine. And the religious sites, of course, would be internationalized in some way, or be an international presence sort of over the old city with all of its religious sites. And that's been the framework. And within that, of course, there's still large gaps between the two sides, particularly over the Temple Mount, which for Muslims is the noble sanctuary, the third holiest spot in Islam. And it's been under Muslim control since the last Crusaders were evicted from Palestine, and no Israeli government is going to touch that. I mean, what do you want to do? Call down 1 billion Muslims throughout the world to devote the rest of their energies to the destruction of Israel? It's just not something that's going to happen. Not even the most hawkish government in Israel has tried to change this arrangement. So that's something any Israeli government would have to accept. Perhaps some way could be worked out for Jews to have a place for prayer on the Temple Mount. At the moment, Muslims won't even talk about that. But perhaps if there were a better framework for peace, this is something that could be worked into it. But then, of course, there are people on the Israeli side who want to go in and tear down the 2 mosques that are up there and ignite the whole Muslim world against Israel. They're not the ones, well, they're in, some of these are in the current government, but they're not in charge.
And finally, Professor, do you have any comments on what I touched on in my opening about the relationship of the American Jewish community to Israel today? How do you evaluate that?
Well, the nature of the current government of Israel, which is tied in with not just the Orthodox, but the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. It's the government that 32 of the 64 seats are held by religious parties, and for that read Orthodox. And the majority of the American population is not Orthodox. Only 10% of it is. It creates, I think, a huge gap between, and this is without even getting into the Palestinian issue and other sources of division. This is just a question like, can women pray at the wall? Which, of course, American religious movements, apart from the Orthodox, are strongly in support of. And there are going to be actions taken by this current government that are going to really create problems with the majority of American Jews who simply are operating from different premises. You already see this in, like, the former leader of the ADL, a staunch supporter of Israel over the years, making a public statement about he's now questioning his, I mean, for people like that to openly question their support of Israel because of the current government. Generally, we all make distinctions. If you don't like the policies of the current government, so what? Who said we always like the policies of our own government? You can be against policies in Washington or in particular governments without questioning your loyalty as a citizen to the United States. We need to make the distinction likewise with Israel. Support for Israel as a state and a society is not necessarily support for particular policies you don't like. But there's going to be tremendous pressure here because some of these policies that are going to be coming up, particularly those pushed by the two Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, that's going to be more of a source of division, I think, than the Palestinian issue, which, as I said, there's no movement on anyway. So sorry to give you that answer, but that's the only honest one I can give.
Okay, on that note, we want to thank you on behalf of Hadassah and the Jewish Federation. We're so grateful for your time tonight and for giving us a view of the history that we all need. And thank you so much, Professor. And I hope people will take advantage of the books that you've written and the resources that you have available. So for everyone from Hadassah and the Federation, I bid you all a good night.
Thank
Bye.
you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate it.
Hey,
Thank you, Alan.
thank you.
Excellent talk. Excellent talk. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Shalom.
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 Good night, Alan.
Jerry, you didn't mute yourself and we heard you coughing and guffawing and whatever you were doing.
Oh,
there.
I'm sorry. I muted the minute I started coughing. I apologize. I apologize. It was an
So I
excellent talk.
only got one question. I had the rest of the questions were just mine. Only one person put a question in the chat, which I thought was interesting.
Mhm.
I put a question in about the Netanyahu government specifically trying to subordinate the judiciary in Israel.
Wait a minute, I didn't see it.
Oh,
Hold on.
Well, as long
I
as I'm
don't-
still here, would you like to?
Wait a minute, I didn't see it.
Oh,
Marcia,
you're
did you
still
see
there.
it?
Yeah, I'm still
Yeah.
here.
The
So
one about Netanyahu's current government?
I don't
Yeah.
have that.
And
Yeah.
the judiciary.
Oh,
Professor,
it came to me. I didn't realize it came to
I
me
didn't,
by
you didn't send
myself.
it to me. Did any others come
Professor,
in?
I want to ask you
No.
a question.
No.
I thought that you glided over the power of the religious fundamentalists in Israel when you did not discuss the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin,
Right.
which I saw as a real blow to the prospects of peace.
well, you're right about that. Again, as it was, I wasn't able to shoehorn everything into an hour, really. But yes, I do think the assassination of Rabin was an important turning point. And that Yigal Amir, the assassin, can congratulate himself with changing the course of Israeli politics. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
All right. Dan Bender, did you ask that question that wasn't sent to me? I apologize.
No, it was to me and I didn't realize it was
Oh,
to me.
Are you still there, Carl
Would
and
you
Dan?
like to,
Yes, let me ask it.
words
Yes,
on the judicial? Well, Israel has no constitution, right?
right.
Which means that the Knesset by 61 votes can change anything. I mean, there's a basic law on the judiciary, including the appointment process, which is very much non-political. It's professional. It guarantees continuity and independence, and this is one of the points of attack. But the Knesset, because it's any basic law, can be changed by 61 votes. Now,
Right, that's
so
true.
they can decide that any decision of the Supreme Court could be changed by 61 votes in the Knesset and make that a principle, make that another basic law, or change one of the existing basic laws to include that. The opposite side of that is that the next government comes into power can reverse it by 61 votes.
Right.
This is what happens when you don't have what political scientists like to call entrenchment. Entrenchment means that you need a supermajority to change the Constitution. Like in our case, 3/4 of the state legislatures. And so it makes it much harder to change the Constitution than to just change a law. Israel has no constitution, so
Yeah,
it
is
can change
it,
by a simple majority. Netanyahu says, of course, well, that's democracy. 61
Right.
votes is the majority. That's all you need. Well,
was
of
it
course-
true, is it true, Professor, that actually, unless they do pass these laws, the Supreme Court in Israel has a lot of power, in fact, more power than our Supreme Court, but now they want to be able to overrule the court's decisions by a vote of Knesset, is that right?
What's happened is, because this wasn't laid out, there's a basic law judiciary that covers the composition of the court and sort of tries to lay out its jurisdiction. The Supreme Court of Israel did something that the US Supreme Court did in the early history of this country. In Marbury versus Madison, way early on, Supreme Court assumed the right to rule anything unconstitutional. The Israeli Supreme Court assumed something similar, but of course they don't have a constitution. What they said was, we will invalidate any act of the Knesset that violates basic democratic principles, as set forth in the Declaration of Independence, or as set forth in one of the basic laws. So we'll be the protector of the basic laws and of the. Now, what an override law would do in the Knesset, at least in theory, would be to take that away and say, no, the final word is here in the Knesset. We got 61 votes, you can't invalidate anything.
Right, that violates the separation of powers if there is such an
No.
idea in Israel. Rachel Levy, Rachel, do you have your hand up? You wanted to say something?
Yes, I also had a question. One of the things that I'm following very closely is the war in Ukraine, and I know that Israel has not sent over any weapons or military support, but they did just announce that the foreign minister is going on their first trip to Ukraine soon, and I'm curious how you think that might impact the sides.
Well, Israel has tried to stay out of this. It's rather interesting. I don't say that I totally understand it myself, but Israel is coordinating a lot of its military activity in Syria with the Russians, as strange as that may sound, because the Russians are deeply involved in Syria, and both countries want to involve a head-to-head clash there. So they coordinate these things, and that's apparently created under Netanyahu before. Well, the Ukraine thing started after Netanyahu was gone, but any Israeli government is getting military people saying to them, We need this coordination with the Russians in Syria, and maybe there's some other considerations going there too. Israel's obviously made an effort, and this was under Netanyahu previously, to improve its relations with Russia. So they obviously have not been in the forefront of supporting the Ukrainians. But I'm happy to hear, as you pointed out, that at least they're now willing to send the foreign minister there and give some more support.
Okay, this is great. I'm sorry the other people left, but we always think of these questions afterwards, don't we? Does anybody else? Professor, we're indulging on your time. Is that okay?
Oh, no, I'm ready to talk.
All right, all right.
No, it's
Anybody else
still
have a
afternoon
question?
here.
Anyone else
Well,
have?
I want to observe for everybody that a very right-wing law professor, Alan Dershowitz, and obviously many left-wing Jewish law professors, including Lawrence Tribe, both have spoken out against Netanyahu's attempt, or the Haredi attempt, to remake the Supreme Court or to emasculate the Supreme Court in Israel, and have
Yes.
held the Supreme Court of Israel as an outstanding example of a good judiciary. So, but the opposition to the effort here has unified the right and the left in the American Jewish circle.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that there's some elements in Likud, which is a secular party, at least in theory. There's some elements of Likud, which is still half of this government, that harken back to their founder, to Menachem Begin. Well, he wasn't the actual founder, but harken back to Menachem Begin is certainly their leading figure historically, who was very much for the constitutionality of the system insofar as you could institute it, and defense of the rule of law and these things. In those days, he was fighting the domination of the left in Israel, but nevertheless, there have been in the past some elements on the right in Israel which have been great supporters of the law and order there. And the judicial system has been the strong point of Israeli politics. There's no question.
Excuse me, Sheila, I just wanted to mention something about a little bit more about Israel's not giving arms to the Ukraine, that Israel faces an existential threat from Iran and its attempts to expand Shia influence through the Fertile Crescent arc. And Israel needs the freedom to operate over Lebanon to interdict Iranian supplies that are coming to Hezbollah. And therefore, it would be foolhardy for Israel to send arms and greatly antagonize the Russians, whether it's because Putin was befriended by an old Jewish woman who gave him milk and cookies or whatever. We don't know, but he has been surprisingly tolerant of Israel's operating in the skies over Syria and Lebanon. And that is terribly important to Israel. But Israel did send the first field hospital of any country to Ukraine. So it's not that Israel's between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. Oh, I know as Hadassah has sent fantastic help for the refugees in setting up medical installations on the borders anyway of Ukraine, and done a great job, but separate from the political policies, of course. Professor, what is your thinking about the issue of Iran? The United States, we're going back and forth on whether we're going to try to do another treaty or not do a treaty, or what's the status of all of that, and our relations with Israel.
Yeah, Iran has undergone a turn to a more hardline government recently, and it now seems clear. I saw a briefing by the guy who's in charge of American negotiations. It sounded kind of hopeless that the Iranians have kind of given up on it. That agreement, as much as people have criticized it, did have the Iranians boxed in. And now they're not boxed in anymore. They're a few weeks from having enough fissile material for their first weapon.
Really?
I don't think by anybody's calculation is a good thing. So the first thing that ought to be done is to somehow bring enough pressure on Iran by reviving the sanctions if you have to. For that, we need European consent. It was their participation in the sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. And so we have our sanctions, but the rest of the world is still abiding by the agreement, which means that the Iranians are not being sanctioned as much as they could be. And then that, if that would bring them back to the table, so much the better.
Okay. Thank you so much for this informal session. Is there anyone else who's still on? We still have about 25 people still on the line. Anyone else have a thought before we say goodnight to the professor? The last chance.
All right, well, thank
Okay.
you for the chance to
Thank you.
be a part of the
Thank you.
community with Romana and Chuck, and good to meet the rest of you.
Okay,
And
Pleasure.
Good
Thanks.
Thank you,
thank
you.
you. Thank you so much.
Erev Tov. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Alan.
Okay, bye.
Thank you,
Okay,
Alan.
right. So Marcia.
Yep.
So it turns out there were only two questions then, Dan's and one other person, right?
Yeah,
in
that
the
I
end.
missed. Yeah,
But somehow I didn't get that second, but it was fine. It was fine, you know.
he got it in at the end.
We
It's all
got
good.
it at the end. That was nice. So,
Sheila, you did a
Yes.
great job.
well, thank you. Thank you. Good introduction. And it's not hard to do a good job when you have good people, that you work with good people and a good program, right? That's
Well,
Sure.
thank you,
easy.
thank you for all your efforts, Sheila.
okay. I appreciate it.
It was
and,
really good.
Thanks, Rachel. And,
It was wonderful.
and the last few
Marcia,
people online, we're all going to say goodnight now,
Thank
right?
you, Ramona.
Marcia could just close us down, right?
I can
Marcia?
shut it down. Yep.
Okay.
Good night,
See
everybody.
everyone. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
Bye.